Dr. Molly Carney is going to do a presentation tonight on fleshing out scales of Pacific Northwest pre-contact Camas stewardship, a case study from the Willamette Valley. You guys never make it short and easy for me to say. But anyway, it sounds like it's going to be really good. So Dr. Carney is an OAS Jones Scholarship recipient. She's going to explore the relationship between people and Camas during the Holocene period. And I'm sure we'll be talking about much more than that. She works primarily on the Columbia Plateau. She is a Washington State Research Foundation postdoctoral fellow. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Molly.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for the grant. None of this would have been possible without the support of the OAS. And Sarah in particular has really helped answer all my questions and work through all of this. So I just, it's been fantastic working with everyone. So thank you all again. It'll take me just one moment to pull it all up, okay?
So I should have said, or Paula, jump in if you want, this is being recorded. So if anybody has concerns about that, you're so advised. Paula, you have any other words of wisdom?
Feel free to type your questions in the chat as they come up. We'll just field them at the end.
Sounds good. I see a great screen here, Molly. So I think on our end, you're ready to go.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of this research with you, but also just hearing what you have to say or think about it, or if you have suggestions for the future. So today I'll be talking about hunter-gatherer plant management practices, specifically from we're looking at niche construction, but also traditional ecological knowledge. So my overall argument and what I will be demonstrating today is that I think people were harvesting Camas in the past, not based on like the size of the bulb. A lot of, I don't know if you know Stephanie Kramer's work from the University of Oregon. She was looking at like, are people picking Camas bulbs based on how big they are? And so I've actually worked with her, and we've come to realize, and what I'll show, that people are actually harvesting bulbs from Camas plants based on their relative maturity levels, rather than picking bulbs just because they're the biggest or the fattest of the bulbs too. And so I'll actually talk about two case studies. I'll primarily focus on the Willamette Valley in Oregon, although I also have data for the Pandare Valley in northeastern Washington, and they're pretty similar ecologically, so they make good comparative case studies too. And both places are pretty well known for their archaeological record of Camas fields and earth ovens, as well as Camas exploitation in general. And so I'll argue and demonstrate that in both locations, these practices of what I call selective harvesting, so only picking these mature Camas plants, it actually begins around 3,500 years ago in both places, which is really interesting too. And so I'll also show that contrary to, we'll get into a little bit of the niche construction and trying to understand if Camas was actually domesticated or not. And so according to tradition, or according to how niche construction theory works, it says that these practices that people were doing for many years in the Willamette Valley don't actually result in domestication in our traditional sense. And it actually makes quite a neat and interesting case study that I think has a lot of potential to inform not just the Northwest or people interested in traditional foods of our region, but also people trying to understand how plants are domesticated or are part of everyday diets really across the globe as well too. So I am specifically focusing on Camas we know that Camas grows everywhere. It was consumed throughout much of Western North America, from Northern California up through British Columbia. It even grows on the edge of the plains where the Rocky Mountains meet the Front Range as well too. So really, really wide growing, many niches, many different habitats that Camas has expanded into. And some estimates from ethnographic works actually estimate that anywhere between 25 to even 70% of an entire Native American and First Nation groups' diet might have been comprised of camas in specific places too. So it could potentially even have rivaled, salmon in importance for many different groups too. And so this really means that this plant has quite extraordinary economic and cultural importance to many different tribal nations. And so there's quite a bit of interest in understanding how camas was managed and how it was prepared as part of many larger ongoing food security efforts. So this study that I'll be sharing with you today, we're actually using it to try to inform policy within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and across other federal and state and even tribally managed lands too. So it's nice to be able to take archaeology and make sure that it really is relevant for people today as well too. And we also know that throughout much of Western North America, it's pretty well established that Indigenous peoples managed or otherwise cared for many of their plant communities. And so there's quite a bit of really wonderful ethnographic evidence and oral histories that really indicate that people engaged in almost horticultural like practices too. And so while archaeological evidence for plant management or other forms of management, it's a little bit harder to find, but it is slowly emerging, particularly for like the Northwest Coast region. But to shift gears and sort of set the framework for how I'm approaching understanding how people might have been engaging with camas in the past, I look to Robin Kimmerer. So Robin Kimmerer is a botanist. She is a member of the Potawatomi Citizen Nation and also works at a school in ecology, at a university in ecology and botany as well. And so Kimmerer has seen quite a lot of popularity in the last few years. Her book is really gathering steam, but she suggests that we weave we braid or weave three different strands of knowledge too. And so this would be traditional ecological knowledge, like scientific knowledge or Western knowledge, and then also what she calls the plant's own knowledge too. And so by traditional ecological knowledge, I'm just talking about knowledge that is acquired by Indigenous or local people over hundreds or even thousands of years through these direct interactions with their local environments. So when we say Western scientific knowledge too, we're just talking about the more familiar scientific practice that we learn in school, making observations, creating and testing our hypotheses, making sure that we can go through that whole cycle, that our work is, really replicable too. And then finally, I'm also interested in that third strand of knowledge that Kimmerer identifies, which is a little bit different. She calls this the plant knowledge too. And so plant knowledge is trying to understand, what is a plant trying to do? How does a plant react to its external environment? What is a plant's agenda? What is it trying to do every year at different times of different seasons as well? What is its ultimate goals too? So trying to think like a plant in the best way that we're able to do. So this study that I'll share today really seeks to braid these forms of knowledge together to try to provide greater insights into people in Camas in the past too. So I'll look to, traditional ecological knowledge and ethnographic and contemporary descriptions of Camas. I will look to, plant knowledge, and this is when I get a little bit into the weeds with Camas. So I'll try to keep it pretty streamlined too, but we do have to dive a little bit deep into, what is Camas and what is Camas trying to do to really understand how people perceived of and interacted with Camas. And then finally, I'll look to, Western science and niche construction, which really helps us understand patterns of management or, domestication or semi-domestication too. So we'll have to cover all three today to really get at what people are doing in the past. But I'd like to start with the plant knowledge or Camas knowledge first. So these are the two of the most common species of Camas. So we've got common Camas and then great Camas. Common Camas is a little bit shorter It grows everywhere, both on the western side of the Cascades and the eastern side of the Cascades, and even all the way over to the Rockies. Where great Camas primarily grows on the western side of the Cascades, although there's a couple pockets to the east, but mostly the Cascades are the geographic barrier there. Camas is a perennial plant. It grows commonly throughout our region, and it blooms spectacularly for 2 weeks, anywhere from like late April to early June, depending on elevation. And it's pretty popular in people's gardens too. So it's not just growing out in fields or something that people ate. It's really gorgeous. And so a lot of people have played with the plant over the years too. There's actually 5 different species, but we're only going to worry about 2 of the most common for this particular talk. So all forms of Camas, it grows from a bulb. It grows and often produces these big blue to purple to sometimes light blue flowers. And it really you often find it growing in poorly drained fields or prairies, and they often have what we call those xeric moisture regimes. So, typical Northwest weather, rains a lot in the winter, it gets cold, and then in the summer it dries out and the plant goes dormant during those periods, and it's really necessary for the plant's particular lifestyle, and it's adapted to these weather and climatic patterns as well. And so finally, it can be a little bit difficult to tell the 2 apart. Great Camas is taller and it's just generally bigger. But if you don't really know what you're looking for, you might not pick up on it. And then the petals apparently they're supposed to be pointed in different directions, but I personally have had trouble with that one. But what's interesting is that Nancy Turner has worked with many different Native American and First Nation groups over the years, and she's noted that in looking at the linguistics, people didn't really distinguish between common and great Camas across many of these groups too, and so we'll treat them mostly as the same for the sake of this particular study. And then finally, the bulbs are edible. You have to cook them for a really long time to break down the complex carbohydrates in the bulbs. But once you do, they're pretty tasty. They're kind of like yams. And you can dry them out and put them into cakes, and then store them for years, many years. I know Lewis and Clark, I think they referenced once that they'd had Camas that was several years old, and they said it wasn't particularly tasty, but that it was still very edible too. So they also have some funny comments on they ate Camas that wasn't cooked long enough, and they had indigestion. So those are amusing to read from back in the day. But moving on, just wanted to talk just a little bit more about the plant knowledge or Camas knowledge. And so Camas is a bulb. And so I have on here a little crosscut diagram that I drew of a Camas bulb. And so all bulbs, including Camas, they're not actually roots, but they're actually underground leaf bases. And so they all have these different leaves, and you can see the leaves on this cross section right in here. And sometimes they're called scales. I'll try to call them leaf scales. But a good way of understanding this feature is I always reference Shrek. I guess it's getting kind of older, but Shrek is talking to Donkey, and he says that ogres are like onions; they have layers. And so this applies to all bulbs. All bulbs have layers, in particular Camas, and so these different leaf scales will appear as those layers in the bulb too. And so these leaf scales are actually really important in understanding how plants may have been managed in the past too, because as we'll show, I've actually had the opportunity to look at immature and mature Camas bulbs across all ages too, and chop them up and look at these leaf scales. And I found that these leaf scales actually indicate roughly how old a bulb is. So it's not quite as one-to-one as tree rings. So it's not like 1 year and you get 1 ring. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it is a great way of understanding and getting a feel, or getting a pulse on how old a bulb might have been when it is harvested, or when you yank it out of the ground too. And then finally, just a little bit more about Camas. This isn't that important to our discussion tonight, but just that a lot of studies have shown that there's actually quite a number of factors that influence bulb size in different parts of, or different expressions on the plant too. So, there's a lot of work on pH, probably influences bulb size, as well as the color of the flowers. Topography 100% impacts Camas plants and how high they can grow in bulb size, including moisture, so like slope aspect, and then even soil compaction is going to have a big difference. So hard clays, Camas doesn't really grow very well in. It needs like nice and loose soil. And then finally, many Camas plants, they actually reproduce through putting out seeds primarily, but some do reproduce asexually. So some do have these little offsets, these little offset bulbs are what they're called. And it's estimated that about 15% will reproduce asexually through those offset bulbs. And that if you actually damage a Camas bulb, so if you've ever seen a digging stick, I didn't put an image of it in here, but if you've ever seen a digging stick and when you go into pop out Camas bulbs, there's a chance that you're going to pierce the bulb, or if you've ever dug in a Camas field, you know that you'll probably slice the bulb. But that actually means that some of those bulbs, they have a higher chance of reproducing asexually or through those little offsets. So even the act of digging Camas bulbs probably worked to create more bulbs too. So this is just another way of looking at how people might have, managed plants in fields in the past. And then finally, I talked about those interior layered leaf scales as well too. And so again, I was able to work with a nursery, Hanson's Nursery, and work with other groups, and we're able to look at immature and mature Camas plants and able to tell that those interior leaf scales, and again, I have an archaeological one up on the screen too, but just that they have statistically significant different number of leaf scales at these different points within their life histories or their life cycles. And so immature bulbs will have like 2 to 3, sometimes even 1 scale, whereas these sexually mature bulbs, these ones that are producing seeds, they'll have 4 to 5 to 6 to even more leaf scales within them too. And so that really helps us to get a feel for roughly how mature this plant is when it is harvested, and also to just establish quantifiable measures for really looking at ethnographic behaviors and management, to see if these behaviors have changed through time, or how far in the past those behaviors really extend. So shifting gears slightly, just wanted to cover some of the traditional ecological knowledge. And so again, there's many fantastic ethnographic, historic, and contemporary sources which describe how Camas was taken care of in the past, in ways that are probably pretty similar to our understandings of horticulture or gardening. For example, we know that fields were probably intentionally burned. We know that competitors were removed. I have a great side note. I hope it's okay to just take a really quick aside. I was speaking with a woman a couple of years ago, and she shared that her ancestors would actually take, death camas looks pretty similar to camas. It's another plant, but it is highly poisonous. But they would plant death camas in some of their family plots of normal camas. And then they wouldn't tell anyone about where they planted it. And that was a way of marking ownership over a plot too. So people wouldn't come in and just harvest indiscriminately. So that is something that has always stuck with me, that I am interested in exploring a little bit in the future too. But normally when you're going through and you're removing competitors, you're getting rid of the death camas so you don't accidentally harvest it. We also know that even the act of digging or harvesting would work to aerate soils, would work to like loosen up soils and create more space for camas bulbs. And we also know that camas is usually harvested in midsummer. So I have on here a quick image of what it looks like when it's not flowering and gorgeous. And so when you actually go to harvest, and I've had the opportunity to harvest with a tribe a couple of different times, and we will go through and we'll actually use our digging sticks and pop the bulbs up. And then what you do is you can break off the capsules and break off those seeds and then replant them. And you'll also replant all the other immature bulbs that you pull out of the ground as well, to this way, ensuring that you'll have a harvest in the future. And these seed capsules actually work to, mark which ones are the most mature bulbs too. So it's quite easy to see from the surface when you're going through a different camas field which one is ready to be harvested too. But all of these behaviors are quite literally modifying environments and are quite literally creating these niches which are very conducive to camas growth too. So this brings me to our final strand of knowledge, which is niche construction. So this is our Western scientific perspective. So niche construction is quite a powerful explanatory framework for understanding domestication pathways, for understanding how and why humans and other species really enter into what we call these mutualistic relationships. And so, niche construction theory helps us to understand these different interactions between people and other plant and animal species, which not only transform landscapes as they're creating niches conducive for these different species, but these relationships also have been shown to transform the genomes of humans and other species as well too. And so if niche construction is just this term for these different processes or environments are modified by organisms, then some have actually really argued that our definitions of plant management are really pretty synonymous with that of niche construction. So plant management is just intentional actions or input or engagement with different plant organisms to achieve specific goals, which might be increased abundance or predictability. It's really just the same thing too. So when we talk about management, we're really just talking about niche construction and creating these different environments for these different, plant and also animal species too. And so, there's quite a bit of literature on the origins of agriculture. We could get into all of that, domestication pathways, and I just think that there's not a single framework that's going to work for all of these instances or different case studies, but since we have these traditional descriptions of plant management which so closely align with niche constructing activities too, that I really do think it's a useful way of understanding and then explaining these human plant relationships in the past too. So here we're really just testing like two specific things, looking at, are people selecting for increase in bulb sizes, or are they selecting for bulbs based on this relative maturity level too? So I just outlined a couple hypotheses too on here. And so I tried to simplify it down to two different options that we might see within the archaeological record. So if people are harvesting camas bulbs, just regardless of maturity, they're just grabbing indiscriminately, I would expect to see bulbs across all of these ages or maturity levels that are collected too. So we'd have a wide range of those like leaf scale numbers. Maybe we might see selection for bulb size or some other particular, trait within the plant itself, but we would just see, a wide range of different leaf scales. And then just thinking about this more in depth too, this strategy, if people are employing this particular strategy, it might be more time or labor efficient if you're at one site to just kind of grab everything you encounter. And it might be a great strategy, if you don't have any pressures on your populations or your resources, either, humans or other predators or nothing else, stressing camas populations. But it would probably deplete, resources in local environments, as it does take, 4 to 5 years for camas to regrow back too. And so I have another strategy on here as well too, which I call selective harvesting. So in this strategy, people are only picking the mature bulbs. We would probably see archaeological camas bulbs with higher numbers of leaf scales. And so we have to infer, because we haven't figured out a way to test this archaeologically yet, but we have to infer that people are probably sowing and replanting the seeds and also the immature bulbs while they're going through and harvesting. And so this would probably take more time, but these actions would ensure future harvests down the line. So thinking, for people in the future too. And so, I simplified this into these two strategies is probably a little bit more nuanced than that. But it's a good way to have a spectrum to kind of get a feel for. And then finally, I included the 2 photos on here too, just so this is I think it's on the left, hopefully it's on the left for you. It's a modern great Camas bulb. And so if you look really closely, I should have turned the brightness up a little bit, but you can see the leaf scales within this particular bulb too. So you can see how this actually looks within an actual Camas bulb. And then on the right, I have an archaeological bulb too. And so that, not everything that we excavate comes out perfect, right? Taphonomy is a real thing that we have to deal with as archaeologists. And so often the bulbs are a little bit broken too. So I included this photo too, because you can see how sometimes you don't even have to slice a bulb in half to really understand, count the leaf scales. Sometimes you can just kind of take a look at it, which is really nice. And no one likes to break stuff apart. But finally, let's get to our case study now that I've covered quite a bit of background. Sorry for taking a little bit of time to get here, but the Willamette Valley. So the Willamette Valley is very well known for these open floodplains and these broad Camas fields. So many different vegetation reconstructions based on historic records. So I have one on the screen too, which I just love. They went through and looked at settler diaries and descriptions of landscapes from around the 1850s too, and put together on a GIS layer, on a map layer, what they think the vegetation of the Willamette Valley would have looked like too. And so that combined with quite a bit of, paleoclimate reconstructions and lake coring data as well too. All of this together really indicates that the Willamette Valley was probably much more open than it is today. And so that you had prairies and savannas and these open woodlands, which were maintained through periodic anthropogenic fires. And then again, ethnographic and archaeological and even historical ecological data from this area really indicates that this place was quite a renowned gathering ground for, even many groups too, and some of the best documented examples of Camas exploitation. So you find, as quite common in the archaeological record, that you see these large, substantial in-ground earth ovens with tons of fire-cracked rock, or fire-modified rock, whatever the term is right now, in which you had Camas and other plant foods that were baked in these big in-ground pits too. Looking, ethnographically and archaeologically from, at least from, the late Holocene period too, we do know that people were probably living in permanent villages during the winter months, traveling to upland or other resource locations during the summer and drier weather as well too. And we also know that, people aren't just eating Camas here too. We know that people also consumed wapato, hazelnuts are pretty common, berries, acorns appear in paleoethnobotanical reports. We know that many different game species as well as fish too were also important in diets, although salmon is somewhat debated about, if it could have made it up the river or not, and if so, like for how long in the past. But quite a wide and diverse range of different foods that were consumed. But I was able to visit the archives at the University of Oregon this past November with the support of the Jones Grant, and was able to take a look at their archived collections too. So I was able to look at over 700 archaeological Camas bulbs across 10 different sites. They are sort of labeled up here, although the yellow looks a little funny on my labels, but that's okay. And so when I looked at all of these 700 Camas bulbs, I was able to measure the length, the width, and the thickness, to get a feel for diameter and size and volume of every Camas bulb. I also weighed them all. And then I was able to count the number of visible leaf scales for each of the carbonized bulbs if they were visible. And then I also worked with the museum too to take a subsample of all of these bulbs. And so I randomly subsampled 20% of all the whole ones. And then I would cut them in half and then count the number of leaf scales there too. And so with the support of the Jones Grant, I was able to get 3 additional radiocarbon dates from the Lynch site. And then I was able to recalibrate all of the radiocarbon dates that had been produced through all of these other reports and all these other excavations with the latest curves that were released last summer, I think. And once we were able to cross-correlate the leaf scale data with all the radiocarbon data, this left myself with 330 bulbs for this particular analysis too. And so I used some, it's very similar to like the t-test, but it's for archaeological data, for data that's just kind of a little weird. But we're able to use that to compare our archaeological Camas with some of these modern populations too that I had previously done the work on. So those mature and immature control data sets, and we compared those with the archaeological Camas to see if they're similar or different too. And then also, looked at change in bulb size over time as well too. And so I put together a quick little box plot of the leaf scale data. So we have leaf scale data on this side of the graph on our y-axis, and then I put all of the archaeological Camas bulb data into 500-year time bins. Just picked 500 years arbitrarily. I would like to do it maybe a little bit more closely aligned with chronology, or try to slice it different ways. But this seems to be the best way to slice it up, given the numbers that we currently have. And this is our mature control populations here on the side as well too, and immature control populations. But I'll just quickly run through some of the results as we move up through time. So the oldest bulbs ever known for the Pacific Northwest of Camas are from the Hannibin Creek site. And these are overwhelmingly the most mature bulbs, and surprisingly, they're also the largest of all the bulbs too, of all of our other sites too. And so here we can just say that, people were only selecting very mature, very large bulbs. And so I have a hypothesis as to why that is, which I'll come back to in a little bit. Then we have a bit of a break in our time periods. We don't really have any data from the 8,000 to 6,000 year-ish period, but roughly from 6,000 to 5,000, and you could probably extrapolate that even to about 4,000 years ago. I interpret the archaeological Camas data as a stripping strategy, where we do see people are pulling Camas bulbs across all maturity levels. And so what's interesting is that many of these, particularly these two periods, they're very different from both the mature and the immature Camas control samples too. And so we really see this as people are pulling from all maturity levels. They're not selecting Camas bulbs based on maturity level whatsoever. They're picking them for some other reason, or they're just grabbing them all, but that it's just not, they're not looking for that particular characteristic of the Camas plants too. However, by about 3,500 years ago, we start to see this pattern of people selecting primarily sexually mature bulbs, so primarily these older Camas bulbs, and they continue to do so from this 3,500 year mark up until present too. And so this is particularly fascinating because if you think a little bit more broadly, 3,500 years ago is roughly this time period where we see people shifting their relationships with plants and other material cultural patterns tend to change across many different cultural and geographic regions throughout the Northwest too. And so I believe it's Megan Walsh's work, who works with lake sediment cores. And a lot of her work indicates that people actually start and increase the number of anthropogenic fires in the Willamette Valley at about 3,500 years ago. So anthropogenic burning becomes very common, and we also start to see people are, selecting only these mature bulbs. These fires are probably pretty low intensity controlled burns, which are really designed to keep landscapes open and clear, to encourage game animals, but also to, keep them clear for plant foods as well too. So it times out fascinatingly well. In the Willamette Valley too, this is roughly when the late Holocene period begins at about 3,000 years ago. And in this period is where you start to see a growing number of residential sites, which are argued to be indicative of increasing sedentism, or people staying in one place for large portions of the year. And we also see archaeological evidence for the mound building traditions began at about 3,000 years ago. And so these places are probably stable residential locations or villages where people repeatedly stay and build up over time as well. And then further too, in the Great Basin of Oregon, so not, Willamette Valley, but not too far away, quite a bit of research says that, again, 3,500 years ago is really where people start to rely on bulbs and other root type foods as a whole. And it's really argued that the shift in subsistence practice also coincides with people changing the locations and duration of their winter village settlement patterns too. So there is something very interesting happening at this 3,500 year mark, where people really do change their relationships with landscapes too, and you see it in the Camas data as well. So it just is incredible to see this archaeologically. And so I was also interested in just seeing if there's any correlation with Camas and climate over time too. So I won't hit this one too hard, just that this top graph is a proxy for precipitation from a lake, although it's there just aren't that many paleoclimate data sets out there to work with, so it's a little farther away than I would like. And then we also have proxies for temperature. So this one's from Vancouver Island, this one's from a coastal lake too. It's a little bit higher resolution too, but you can see how these changes in temperature and precipitation may have impacted or not impacted the Camas data that we have from archaeological sites too. And then this final one on the bottom, this is I estimated Camas bulb volume or size too. And so I just plotted that data against time periods moving up through time to just get a feel for if people are selecting for the bigger bulbs or not too. And so again, from Hannibin Creek, from these 8,000-ish year old feature too, we do have, remember, those are the largest bulbs and they're also mature bulbs too. And so this is correlated with a pretty warm period as, people are moving out of the the Holocene, are moving out of the altithermal too. So it's getting a little bit cooler. What's interesting though is that people are only picking large bulbs and the most mature bulbs, and so this is purely a hypothesis. But if human populations are much lower at this time during this paleo period, people really could just pick the cream of the crop. They could pick whatever they want. There's not a lot of harvesting pressure on Camas populations too, and so you can pick whatever you want without stressing the Camas populations. And so from 6,000 to 5,000 years ago too, temperature is a little bit cooler, stabilized precipitation. But we also see quite a wide spread of both bulb sizes. So you can see on here that we do have quite a big spread of the size of bulbs. And we also know that people are also pulling bulbs across all of these different maturity levels too. And so again, we interpret this as a period of indiscriminate harvesting or this stripping period. And then, moving up through time, we do have a pretty sharp cooling event about 3,000 years ago too. And so we do have fewer numbers, but I think this is just a product of just not finding, features, because I think Camas niches probably would have expanded. So I don't really see any correlations here with Camas or climate and Camas. But this is again where you do start to see people picking primarily mature bulbs, but we do have a decent spread too. So it doesn't appear that people are really selecting for bulbs based on size, but again, maturity. And then I tested this statistically too with a couple of different statistics tests to see if both bulb size and even to try and weight too, if they varied, and they don't vary significantly through time. So we don't have any evidence that these are features that people are really picking or selecting for other than this 8,000-year-old period as well too. And so overall, we just don't really see evidence that these harvesting practices may have led to an increase in size over time or weight over time, or that there's any climatic influences on size or weight over time. Rather, that people are, again, they're picking their Camas based on if it's mature or not. And oh, there's our selective harvesting that I forgot to click on too. And then I don't want to hit this one too hard. I don't want to keep you all too long, but we did look at, domestication syndrome traits. And so I'll just flip through it very quickly. Camas has some domestication syndrome traits, but it doesn't have all too. And so we don't really take this as evidence that Camas was ever domesticated, that it wasn't any of the mutualistic relationships that people were engaging with these plants in the past would have led to any form of selection really on the plants too. And so we argue that my co-authors on the paper and I, we really argue that this is an alternative pathway. So it's something totally different than domestication practices that you see within like wheat or other seed crops and such. And instead it is just this whole other direction that we need to be kind of focusing on in understanding why people eat certain bulbous plant foods. And so finally, again, just to reiterate this main point too, people are harvesting these wild plant foods, and it's not really a stage or a step below domestication or agriculture, but it's a really interesting and viable strategy that would have ensured that immature and even dormant bulbs would have remained within these fields too, as well as the injured bulbs, the bulb fragments, the little offsets. All of these would have stayed within the field and would have ensured future harvests, as people would repeatedly come back to these places over time too. And so we also don't really see in the data either evidence for really large bulbs either. So people are probably leaving those in the ground too, recognizing that those large bulbs have a greater chance of producing more bulbs in the future as well too. So these are very deliberate strategies aimed at ensuring that you're going to have a food source for much of the future too. So it is a very versatile but also sustainable subsistence practice. And so this is just a case study, and I did just quickly want to cover the data for the Pandare Valley as well in northeastern Washington state, just because it's very similar too. And so I think that these patterns probably do play out throughout the larger Pacific Northwest as well. And so we've also tested these ideas in the Pandare Valley in northeastern Washington, which is pretty similar in terms of geography. Wide open valley, formal glacial lake beds, definitely no salmon in the Pandare Valley. People would rely pretty heavily on game animals and other forms of trout too. And so culturally and geographically, it's technically part of the Columbia Plateau, although it does get quite a bit more rain than other parts of the plateau as well too. And so Camas grows quite abundantly there. And so I worked quite closely with the Kalispel tribe, who are in this particular stretch of the river in the region. And I was able to visit their curational facility and look at their carbonized Camas bulbs too. And so here, these were excavated in the 80s, looked at over 600 different bulbs here. But we didn't have quite as many radiocarbon dates, so I only was able to correlate radiocarbon dates with the leaf scale data for about 100 Camas bulbs. And so we only have data for about 4,000 years. But I did just want to point out a couple quick striking similarities here too. And so again, for the 4,000 to 3,500 year time period, it does appear that people are pulling a wide range of Camas bulbs. And so we call this strategy stripping again. The 3,000 to or 3,500 to 3,000 year timeline, and possibly even farther, it does appear that people are selectively harvesting. And so again, this is where archaeological summaries of the plateau and the region really see these practices of bulk processing Camas become fully routine during this time period as well. Then I do have a period here, the 2,500 to 1,000-ish period where the data flip-flops a bit. And so it could be just, we don't have quite a large number of archaeological bulbs for this period, but I do know that in the plateau, there's quite a number of other interesting changes happening during this period. This is where people abandon pit houses to live in tule mat lodges too at different times throughout the region. People seem to be shifting to storing food within their homes, to storing food in storage caches. We know that trade and human movement increases. We actually see evidence that Camas is traded across hundreds of kilometers too. And so there was something happening culturally across this period too, which kind of correlates with this strange pattern we've got in the data. But then from about 1,000 years to present too, we do see people really targeting primarily mature bulbs too. And so this is a period where this practice becomes really firmly established. And so, you know, these are just 2 case studies, but it does seem like it would be worthwhile to see if these patterns persist in other places. And, you know, I think the wide open valleys of the Willamette Valley and the Pandare Valley might be a little bit different in how people engage with Camas plants versus some of the more northern or coastal regions too, where you really have to keep fields open and clear using fire too, or else you get quite a bit of encroachment from trees too. And so that might play out differently in the archaeological data, but I do have plans to access some of those collections in the future too. And then almost through the whole thing too, but I just wanted to share quickly a little bit more too, looking at the paleoethnobotanical work that has been done in the Willamette Valley too. So what are the other plant foods and animal foods that people are eating? And then it's interesting because for the Willamette Valley and Pandare too, people aren't, you know, just eating camas. So I looked at the Mill Creek paleoethnobotanical reports for Willamette Valley too, and many of these features which have camas in them, people are also processing hazelnuts as well as faunal remains. They're just, you know, really cooked down bones, so you don't have IDs on them. But people are using these features to process quite a wide variety of different things too. And you see like many different wood charcoals used in the ovens as well too. And then when I was going through the collections and the archives, I did notice that there are other root foods, and then not even bulbs, but corms are another kind of like round, not total root thing that people were eating in the past that were misidentified as camas in the past too. So there's quite a wide range of foods. And same thing in the Pandare Valley, you've got onions, glacier lily, you know, berries, and even pine nuts are being processed in these same features too. And so in another paper that we just submitted, I actually argue that these earth oven features are often reused, and people will come back to them and reuse them. And you can even think of them as like a persistent place, a place where people come in and cook food and get together in gatherings and repeatedly come back to the same earth ovens for time and time again too. And so what's interesting is that archaeologists like to talk about plant food intensification and use, you know, earth ovens and dates as markers of that. But I think the story here is actually much more nuanced as well, and that if people are, you know, reusing these features, there's quite a bit going on, more than just intensifying one particular plant food too. And so, you know, finally, I'll just wrap this up because we've gone 45 minutes, and I would like to take a little time for questions too. But, you know, just really reiterate that by looking at the traditional ecological knowledge, you know, the plant knowledge, and then Western science, niche construction theory too, we have demonstrated that, you know, people are selectively harvesting camas based on maturity and really not interested in how big the bulbs are through much of the last 3,500 years too. I would like to expand this study too, and I've started, you know, putting feelers out to different archived collections too, and try to look and see if these patterns persist in other places. And so if you know of any Camas collections too, I would love to hear of them, because I think it would be fascinating to use the resource that is, you know, previously excavated collections too, to try to understand if these practices really persist more widely as well too. And so I have earmarked a couple, but I'm always on the lookout for more too. And then I'm also, you know, interested in fire and you know, looking at past niches, looking at foods beyond Camas, some other different spin-offs as well too. But the most important part here though is just that I do have some collaborators at U.S. Fish and Wildlife and several different tribes who have, you know, agreed to set up test plots to really ground truth some of the stuff that we're seeing archaeologically. And commitments from them too to really use these findings in contemporary management plans too. And the larger goal is to really increase production and access for tribal communities based on what their ancestors were doing in the past too. And so, you know, this braided framework that we use today really helps to, you know, reframe, but also generate new questions about the past, and also to contribute to these ongoing food security projects and the well-being of many Native American First Nation communities throughout our region too. So thank you all for joining me and hearing about this project. And there are quite a number of people at the University of Oregon and the Jones Scholarship too, as well as Sarah Taylor, who was fantastic in coordinating everything, and quite a number of other people. But I'd love to hear any thoughts that you all have and talk to or answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic. For anyone that hasn't read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, I highly suggest it. She's got a great audio version. You can actually hear her read her own book, and it's fantastic. So thank you, Molly. Thank you very, very much. I highly encourage people to ask questions in the chat. I have a couple questions myself. So you mentioned that you, for this study, did not kind of differentiate between the two types of camas in our area. Do you know, are they able to cross-pollinate? Like, are they, do they cohabitate in the same area and then cross-pollinate? Like, are you able to actually differentiate between them, or does that size thing kind of go right out the window?
So they're usually not like growing right next to each other, but they can cross-pollinate and they can hybridize. I mean, you can, one of the things I played with was like looking at the cells on the different bulbs too, and see if those were diagnostic. And they're sort of, it's like great camas, they're like a little angly, and then common camas, they look kind of like bones. But it's not perfect, and things don't always preserve well. So it's like but I did in all of my looking at modern populations, I did differentiate between common and great camas, and the life cycle traits and the leaf scales, those are the same across both species. So that was a path that was pursuable.
Okay. And I had one more question. In your goals for, let's see, for the Willamette Valley study, you only had the one skewed sample, but that sample seemed to be so much larger than every other sample. Do you think that might have contributed to that variation in the numbers?
Could be. Definitely could be. I played with the stats a bit too. So theoretically, using the statistical test that I used, I didn't dive too deeply into that. Theoretically, it should be able to move past, sample sizes, and the numbers that we did have should have been enough, but it totally could be. And so that's why just finding more dates is always always the goal.
For sure. All right, and to the chat section now. Let's see, was camas grown or harvested outside of the Northwest?
It was in California. I know that. I know that Kat Anderson is kind of like the Kimmerer of California, and she's written quite a bit about camas in that region. Although it probably wasn't quite as prolific or important there. And then I'm not so sure about, haven't really encountered any references to it on the plains, but I have seen it growing out there when I've been out there. And then there's an East Coast species too, but I'm not very familiar with how some of those groups may have worked with that plant.
And the next one is, please describe the various Archie sites in the Willamette Valley and in what circumstances the bulbs were found in ovens around habitation sites, ?
Sure, let me flip back to that map so it might be a little easier to see. So the Mill Creek complex was a number of sites, I think 5 or 6, but it might be more than that, that was excavated by the University of Oregon and Tom Connolly. And so he helped quite a bit with granting access to some of these collections and providing all sorts of wonderful photos and such. And that was by, I think, by I-5. And that they argue that those are mostly, the remains of cooking. And so there's some middens in there too, but mostly earth oven features as well. And those ones, there's quite a range of dates associated with those, although that the most of the ones from that 4,000 to 5,000 year period do come from the Mill Creek and from a couple of features there too. So again, that might be, skewing the data a little bit, right? The Lynch site was, if I'm remembering right, I have it all. I had it, it's not right here. But that was one, I think that was in the 70s. And so that was one that only had a couple of dates that we were able to get a couple extra dates for as well too. And so this was again, earth oven features primarily. And then the Benjamin site was roughly the same time period. I'm blanking on the exact details too, but then the Long Tom and the Hannibin Creek were part of this one, and and a drawdown period on the Fern Ridge Reservoir as well too. And so again, most of these are just found with features with earth ovens as well. And so my understanding too is just that identifying residential sites is particularly challenging, or finding like actual houses or living surface as well too. And so you encounter pretty deep middens too, and that is usually taken to be long-term people living in a space. I hope that answers that.
Thank you. All right, got a couple more. What are the nutrients in Camas? So yeah, why are they our first food?
So what's fascinating is that no one's done a nutritional analysis of Camas ever. I mean, it happens with a lot of traditional foods, is that they've done like raw foods, but people weren't eating Camas raw. You'll have horrible indigestion. So one of the projects that we're trying to do is, bake Camas and run the nutritional analyses on it to really get at what the different nutrients. We know that cooking Camas long-term will increase the number of calories because you're breaking down the sugar, so they're much more easily digestible. But that's literally all that we know, because that's much more easier. And it's actually really expensive and really hard to find a lab who's willing to do the nutritional analysis for some of this stuff. So we don't know, but we do know that it is a very different type of sugar than is commonly found in many other sugars, which are many other plant foods. It's like fructose and not glucose. And I think that might also be a contributing factor in some of the diabetes epidemic among many populations.
All right, and one last question in the chat still. Do you know, has Camas been genetically sequenced?
So someone did look at, they were trying to look at dispersal patterns of Camas. And so I recall them using DNA for that, but they pulled from a very small region. And so their argument was that they were trying to understand if people moved Camas around, and they pulled from the Puget Sound. But I don't think they pulled really wide enough for that particular question. So they argue that it's not, but other than that, I'm not aware of any other studies that have gone into that.
Okay, and one more just came through. If Camas wasn't domesticated, is there evidence that people spread the seeds or bulb to the new regions?
There is. So that's another one that's really hard to trace too. And so there was, it's in British Columbia, and they found Camas bulbs outside of where it currently grows. So in a place where it doesn't grow anymore too. So they interpret that as evidence for at least trade. And then there's quite a number of stories about people picking it up and moving it. And we know that, I mean, you can buy it from a nursery and plant it somewhere, and it's probably going to be fine if you just make sure that it, doesn't get, meet a couple of requirements. So we know that it's really easily movable. And so some have argued that is another example that, it has this very long time depth of people working with it.
Well, I would like to thank you for finding a way to take your archaeology and give back to descendant communities. This is fantastic. So if no one has any more questions, I think we can call it a great evening. This was a great presentation. Thank you very much for kicking off our year.
Well, thanks for having me. It was really great. And I hope sometime we'll be able to come back and do it in person.
Yes, we all do. All right, everyone. Till next month.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.